Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. As I said before in one of my videos, Yasunari Kawabata is my favorite Japanese author. Why is he my favorite? There are many reasons, but I always say he is a master of understatement. That is the quality about his work that I enjoy the most. I think his novels, even though they are understated, have a masterful way of conveying the darkness of the human heart in a way that you cannot forget. So I think it's very nice that he is able to combine those two things, subtlety and the darkness that can lie inside of human beings. His stories also, this is another feature that caught my attention always, they seem to end abruptly. If you think about the stories, it's almost like he is not really providing you with the ending to the story. But that is a good thing in this case, because that makes you keep thinking about the story. And actually, I would say that his stories, his novels, and even his, novellas or short stories are not really inconclusive. He always gives you enough details and enough information so that you can keep thinking about the story and complete it yourself. So I think that is something that a great author does. He also, or she also, gives you some work to do. So that is another thing that I enjoy about Kawabata. Now, if somebody came to me and asked me, okay, Jorge, describe Kawabata for me in one word, okay, one adjective, I would say he is balanced. Okay, I think that is the perfect way for me to describe him based on what I know about him. I have read all of his works that I could find in Spanish and in English, but today I wanted to talk to you about a novel that I feel is underrated in the context of his work, which is The Old Capital, also known as Koto or Kyoto, depending on the translation or the edition that you have. Now, when Kawabata was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, the Swedish Academy cited 3 novels as justification for their choice, or maybe as examples of Kawabata's mastery of the art of narrative. They cited Snow Country, okay, which is, it makes sense, right? Snow Country is basically the novel with which most people enter the world of Kawabata, myself included. They also cited Thousand Cranes, which is also, to be expected. It makes sense. These are some of his most famous novels, and many people will say that Snow Country, Thousand Cranes, and The Sound of the Mountain make up a sort of trilogy. So that makes sense. But then the third novel that the Swedish Academy cited was The Old Capital, and that's where you go like, what? Why would they cite that novel? Not many people read it anymore. Yes, this is one of Kawabata's underrated novels, okay? And I will say this, I do not consider it to be his masterpiece, but I definitely think this is one of his best novels, and really a novel that calls for our attention. Let's look first at the characters and the plot a little bit. There are many memorable characters in this novel, but basically the novel focuses on Chieko Sada, who is the daughter of a kimono designer. Her father, Takichiro, the kimono designer, finds himself in a very interesting situation because he has secluded himself in a convent in the hope that he will receive inspiration for this excellent kimono design. So he is waiting to be inspired. That is a very interesting situation in itself. Now, Takichiro has a friend. His name is Sosuke Otomo. He's a weaver. And what he does is, whenever Takichiro has a design, this weaver tries it out and sees if it's going to work or not. Now, the weaver, Sosuke Otomo, has a son. His name is Hideo. And Hideo is a possible marriage match for Chieko. So you can see here how these two families are tied together. They are bound both by trade and by the possibility of a marriage. This is something that Kawabata is really good at, establishing these ties between families, between people, between characters that are almost impossible to break free from. Now, there is one little detail about Chieko that is very important to keep in mind. She is not her parents' biological daughter. She is a foundling. Okay, and this is somewhat of a burden for her. This is something that she is constantly reminded of and that she carries as a burden. The story itself for The Old Capital begins when Chieko and a friend spot, quite by chance, a girl who looks exactly like Chieko. Okay, so I love stories like that, stories of doubles, but as we're going to see, this is not necessarily a story of doubles. So I wanted to focus on three features of the old capital, right? Three elements that this novel provides for us. The first of them is, as I suggested just now, a complicated series of human interconnections, okay? The second one is an art form that is considered to be traditionally Japanese. And finally, what we have are just poetic and beautiful descriptions of the city of Kyoto. So regarding the interconnections, okay, if you have read The Sound of the Mountain, if you have read Beauty and Sadness, you know what I am talking about. And in this novel, The Old Capital, you are going to find another example of Kawabata's ability to arrange his characters in a sort of a spider's web, as a result of the ties that bind them. Regarding the second point, which is tradition, or an element that is culturally Japanese, we have, of course, here the kimono design. If you remember the Master of Go, the game of Go there plays a very important role in A Thousand Cranes. It is the tea ceremony, right? So the role that those things play in those novels. In this novel, The Old Capital, what we have is kimono design. You could also say, for instance, that Snow Country focuses on the whole geisha culture, which is another traditionally Japanese element. So you can see why Kawabata would be considered such a Japanese author, as many people would describe him. And finally, we also have the beautiful descriptions of Kyoto, which are really in sharp contrast with the dark and tormented inner lives of the characters. You could also see a connection with Snow Country here. You can think of the beautiful descriptions in Snow Country of the landscape, of the mountains, of the snow, and all of those things, and think about also the sadness that lies within the characters. So as I said before, this is kind of a story of doubles, right? But without being exactly a doppelganger story. This is not what we have here. One of the questions that The Old Capital poses, or that may be inspired by a reading of this novel, is what would Chieko's life had been like if she had been raised under different circumstances, right? She is basically a foundling, as I was saying before. So is her twin sister, Naeko, what she would have been if things had gone according to plan, right? Really, The Old Capital, what this novel shows you, in a sense, is a character who gets the chance to meet an alternative version of themselves. So quite a fascinating situation that we have here. And the question that I asked myself as I was reading it, is, does environment make me who I am, right? This is one of the central questions of the novel. What role does environment play, right? If you change the circumstances of your upbringing, right? If you change a little thing, maybe moving to a different place or something like that, of course everything changes completely. And in this novel, we get, once again, a character that actually gets, in a way, the chance to meet that other possible version of herself. So that's one of the things that really fascinated me about The Old Capital. I would say that few novels, even few novels by Kawabata, include such complex issues. You know what I mean? So that's why I say also that this is an underrated piece in Kawabata's corpus. Kawabata, okay, he is very subtle most of the time, but he is subtle as a stylist. I think this is where we have to kind of make the difference. He is subtle as a stylist, but the complexity under the surface is really breathtaking, and you see a great example of that in The Old Capital. So once again, underrated novel, really, when you consider the implications, right, that we can entertain while we are reading this book. Let's look a little bit at The Old Capital in the context of Kawabata's work. Kawabata, I understand, considered The Master of Go to be his masterpiece, which is quite an interesting choice if you think about it. The Master of Go is really his most symbolic work, okay, his most allegorical, and his least suggestive by the same token, if you ask me, right? So in that novel, if you remember, the game of Go is basically an allegory for the clash between two generations, between two ways of life, symbolized by the old and the young. Okay, so The Old Capital is not allegorical, I wouldn't say. Or if it is, then the allegory is left up to you. You can interpret that. In The Master of Go, the allegory is much more obvious, right? You can pretty much see what the author is trying to do. In this sense, I would say that The Old Capital is a much more typical novel, typical of Kawabata, right? than The Master of Goa. So it's more closely related to his other novels, to Snow Country, to Thousand Cranes, to The Sound of the Mountain. Maybe I'm thinking Kawabata favored Master of Go precisely because of that, precisely because it's kind of a rare bird in his body of work. You know, that could be one of the reasons why that novel was close to him. For my part, I continue to favor The Sound of the Mountain. If you ask me, that is his masterpiece. It's the one that I enjoyed the most, and I think, I will never change my mind about that. And Beauty and Sadness would be a close second. Another novel that not many people cite when they talk about Kawabata. So why is The Old Capital underrated? Okay, I think, this is just my opinion, right? I think primarily it's because it's a late work. Okay, by the time that Kawabata published The Old Capital, he had already written Snow Country, Thousand Cranes, and all of those other novels that are famous. So that is one of the reasons why I believe that has happened. At this point, really, The Old Capital is pretty much for Kawabata completists. And that is one of the reasons why I read it. If I had just wanted to sample the work of Kawabata or to read maybe 3 or 4 novels, this would probably have not been one of them. And that kind of scares me. You know, I really arrived at it late myself, and I was so captivated by it, but that I really urge you to avoid that mistake. Okay, this is a great novel, and I see no reason why a reader shouldn't enter the world of Kawabata through this magnificent novel. There is a film version of it. Okay, I haven't seen it, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information about it nevertheless. Like most of Kawabata's work, The Old Capital has been adapted into film several times. Okay, and there was one version from 1963 by Noboru Nakamura. Okay, this adaptation of The Old Capital was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, which is another reason why it kind of baffles me that this novel is not more well known. Now, that movie, as you know, competed with Fellini's 8½, and also with Polanski's Knife in the Water. And as we know, Fellini won. Okay, but again, you know, it's a Japanese movie that received attention based on this novel by Kawabata. Once again, I have not been able to watch this movie, but if I ever get the chance to do that, you're going to hear my shouts of joy from wherever you happen to be located, no matter how far away from me you happen to be. So the bottom line, as I've said, I think The Old Capital is a brilliant novel. Okay, in this novel, you're going to find all the elements that make Kawabata an excellent writer and an unforgettable novelist. And I would say that even you're going to find more than that. You're going to find more evident philosophical and existential complexity than you would find in most of his other novels. You know, I know that may be quite a statement, but I actually believe that. If you're new to Kawabata, this is a great place to begin. You're not going to be disappointed. If you are a Kawabata fan and you happen to, not have read this one, you're not going to be disappointed either. Okay, so I think this is, it's kind of win-win, It has something for everybody. So that's why I urge you to read The Old Capital, which for me was quite a pleasant surprise, Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations? I'm listening, as always, so just let me know. Those were my thoughts, my 2 cents on Kawabata's The Old Capital. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.